Hi, everybody, and welcome to my presentation. This is called Living on the Margins, a genealogy of feminist research in social studies. So I began this project because I was interested in why, as a new feminist social studies scholar, I kind of kept hearing about feminism as a research interest that was really peripheral to social studies. So this happened for the first time when I went to my first social studies academic conference earlier this year. And when I was reading the most recent review of feminist scholarship within the social studies, I heard it echoed again in this quote by Shara Bowen, that social studies has feminist scholarship on the margins. And this really made me pause and question, because when I think of something as marginal, I think about it as kind of like insignificant or menial or negligible. So if you look at this image behind here, the trees and the power lines are kind of insignificant because they're marginal. The main point of the picture is the road. So I wanted to use my project to kind of investigate how has feminist research been produced as marginal within the social studies. So in this presentation, I'm going to quickly define genealogy, then I'm going to present my findings, and then discuss some methodological and epistemological issues I've had along the way. So first of all, what is a genealogy? So genealogies are forms of analysis that want to investigate how certain truths have been produced over time. So they don't take truth as a capital T, as a given. They want to see how it's been produced over time. So the process. Genealogies start with a present problem. So my present problem is social studies, feminist research, marginal status in social studies. Then you trace the problems backwards, mainly through documents, and you're trying to look for how has this truth been produced over time. And what this entails is, as you work backwards, you're starting to analyze how the present problem has come to operate as a truth. So, the goal of the genealogy is to take these taken for granted notions about what is true and to say, well, hold up, wait a minute. Let's see how this has been produced over time. Maybe there is a different vantage point that we're not looking at that could give us a new site of resistance or a new site to kind of continue these efforts. So far, I'll present what I'm finding within my genealogical analysis. So a brief history of social studies education is very helpful to kind of frame this. Social studies as a discipline began in the 1920s as part of the progressive educational reform movement. It sought to take fields like history and economics and geography and turn them into school subjects that would be more relevant to students' life. And social studies, the founder were all white men in this time of right after World War I and super high immigration levels into the United States. And so a big focus of how this was supposed to be relevant to students' lives was it was supposed to make them better citizens. So from the start, social studies is concerned with education for citizenship, and it is being articulated and defined from the top, at least, by white men in kind of this context of imperialism, immigration, and the like. So for 50 years, from the 1920s into about the 1970s, social studies, at least in these academic arenas and these kind of upper echelon areas, is really considered unproblematically centered and kind of congealed around masculine ideas. So this is a page from a 1952 Texas textbook. And if you kind of read, you'll see that it is predominantly focused on white men as kind of the central characters and everybody else being really defined as the objects in the rest of the story. So then in the 1970s, about 50 years after the inception of social studies, the women's movement starts. And for the first time, there's academic feminists who start to draw attention to the fact that things like textbooks and curriculums either are glaringly omitting women at all, or if they're mentioned, it's in these very like stereotypical ways in the relationship to men. And so these first feminists from the 70s into the 80s, who are making their first foray into social studies, have to maintain what Barbara Tomlinson called this affect of civility. So this is a rhetorical tone that is idealized in academic discourse. So think about some of the papers maybe you've read in other classes, and it values a non-confrontational and a non-emotional language. And so social criticism, Tomlinson argues, like things like anti-racist or feminist, are really stifled through this rhetorical ideal because it kind of disallows you from a full frontal critique of the discipline within which you are trying to critique. So, in 1992, Nell Noddings, who is an educational philosopher, looks at social studies, which was where she began her career as an educator, and she says, I'm going to look at all the feminist research that's happened so far in the social studies, and I'm going to kind of like articulate what I think feminism's role has been and should be in the social studies. So she argues that feminism needs to create a tradition of its own within the social studies. She is this outside educational philosopher looking into a world that she once was a part of as a teacher, and she has this radical critique. She forgoes the affect of civility to say that traditional social studies has been always from the perspective of men, and that feminists are somehow separate and different from those concerns, and that their power is this ability to conceive of something new, this new social studies outside a social studies that's really assumed and unquestioningly produced as patriarchal. So in the piece, she says, have we as feminists made progress? We note the increase in female names and faces, but the maintenance of central male standards. Is that what we want? Some feminists will say yes, but full equality in the world has been defined by men, even the right to join military and combat roles. Other feminists say no. We want recognition of the important work that has gone unnoticed precisely because the standard of importance has devalued it. So in this kind of first overview of feminist research's position within the social studies, Nell Noddings argues that feminism is a radical critique, but from an outside location. She is worried that if feminist critique gets lodged within the social studies, that it will become subsumed by it. And so she argues that what feminist needs to do is to create a new social studies in a different voice, in this voice that women have that is different than men. And so feminism is produced in this first piece as a radical critique, but only from the location of outside the discipline, and that social studies, because it's inherently patriarchal, can only be rectified by creating a totally new tradition based in feminist and women's voices. So from the 1990s into the 2000s and a little beyond, feminist research in academic social studies really takes flight. So it goes from being kind of in a cocoon in a developing stage to really being a like full frontal concern. And it is the most prolific period of feminist research within the social studies. And that leads to Margaret Carracco. So within social studies, every few years, they'll create handbooks where they will summarize the most important research that's happened within the field by topic. And it wasn't until 2011 that feminism and gender was included in this handbook. So it was kind of a signal to the broader social studies community that feminism is now like a relevant and almost, mainstream topic. It's not just like totally outsiders. And so because this is feminists' first kind of chance to self-define themselves in this mainstay social studies text, Caraco maintains this affect of civility, this non-challenging, non-emotional tone, but really focusing her critique on citizenship. And remember, citizenship is the central concern of social studies. And she kind of frames feminist research as they're a bound group of individuals with kind of similar concerns, and they're circulating into social studies as a separate entity, but within the fold. And she says that feminist research, their power is to create new possibilities kind of within social studies. So she closes her piece by saying, in sum, it's clear that topics concerning girls and women, gender and sexuality have received attention in social studies literature. Has the consideration of these topics become standard practice or a prevailing concern of the field? Clearly not. So after Caraco's piece, social studies research that has a feminist orientation actually really starts to die down. What we start to see is feminism gets really kind of pigeonholed into pretty traditional research topics within the social studies. So things like, again, citizenship, things like curriculum. A few studies are done about teaching and learning in classrooms, are boys or girls better at economics? But by and large, feminism comes not as an outside radical critique, but becomes housed in these little research pockets that have kind of been traditionally defined. And so 6 years later, after Caraco gives her chapter, now Shara Bowen's invited to write a next handbook chapter, a next summary of feminist research within the social studies. And again, she does not engage in a radical critique. She is a social studies scholar. This is her job. And she is writing in a social studies trade, research book. So she forgoes this radical critique of the discipline to instead focus on these specific pockets of feminist research within the social studies. And she kind of surmises that feminism within the social studies is living on the edges. She's saying that, within considerations of citizenship, within considerations of curriculum, that feminism is a tool of critique, but it's only able to kind of speak to a unique and pointed frame of reference, right, about gender or women. And so because those conversations are so vast, feminism is kind of, again, pushed to the side of these conversations as kind of not the main questions. And she frames feminist research power as this like collective struggle against a presumed social studies that is patriarchal, but that she's unable to call as such because this affect of civility really restricts the tone that scholars are able to make in terms of lodging their critiques. So she ends her piece by saying gender and feminist scholarship continues to reside on the margins of social studies education research. Although gender and feminist scholarship may have come a long way, the road ahead is rocky and uneven. So in this telling, feminist research is produced as a tool of critique, but only within these central tropes of the field. And it is marginalized within these research interests because it is but one kind of perspective on research interests that have a huge conversation kind of surrounding them. And she defines feminist research as powerful because it is like a collective, oppositional movement against social studies in its patriarchal tradition. So let's review. Nodding comes in 1992 with this first assessment of feminist research possibilities within social studies. And she says feminism is this radical outside critique and that feminists need to create a new social studies in a different voice or they're always going to be kind of hemmed in by the system that was originally created all the way in 1920 that was never going to contend for their voice. Then Caraco comes in 20 years later and says, well, yeah, feminism is a tool of critique, but really we should house it in these central tropes of the field. We shouldn't be outside critiquing. Let's get inside and critique things like citizenship and curriculum. That will lead to a more inclusive social studies. And she sees social studies as this kind of ether with feminism as this bound, distinct entity that moves within social studies but is still separate from social studies. Finally, Bowen comes in and she says, yes, feminism is a tool of critique for central tropes, and in their critique, they're marginalized because they are subsumed into these larger considerations that are already happening in the field. So in sum, this is what I've been kind of thinking about in my analysis, that feminist research has been produced historically as a reaction against social studies that is essentialized yet unnamed as patriarchal. So there is this truth operating underneath all of these analyses that social studies is a closed project that is primarily interested in men and men's accomplishment. And because of that, feminist research has been produced as an outside stance. It could be an outside stance in Notting's formulation as an outside of the whole field looking in and critiquing. But as social studies scholars started to pick up feminism, they got bound more and more tightly by this affect of civility to really just focus on traditional research topics and kind of forego that more radical outside critique. And in effect, as this happened over time, feminist research gets produced as marginal because it gets subsumed into these broader research topics. So I'm really starting to think about, like, what does this mean? Where do I see this creating a new site for resistance or a new orientation? And I was reminded of the Gloria Andelzula quote. She says, "A perspective from the cracks enables to reconfigure ourselves as subjects outside the us-them binary." When I look back through my data and I see the ways in which feminism has defined itself as a bound, separate entity from a social studies that is assumed to be inherently patriarchal, there's no changing it, it's organic nature, I feel like that creates an us versus them, which will always produce feminist research on the edges. But instead of being on the edges or on the margins, which has a derogatory connotation, I imagine that feminism has always been within the cracks of social studies, that they have been operating through these fault lines and fissures, the negative spaces that have not been articulated, but that are still part of the whole. And instead of being defined as feminists against social studies, perhaps taking a new view that feminists have always been embedded within the social studies, and that this view from the crack can maybe help us reconfigure ourselves as more rightful heirs to the social studies tradition instead of just defining it as a patriarchal pursuit. So, a little bit about how I came to these findings, or I continue to come to these findings, and kind of the challenges that have presented itself. So the first is I am an insider in one sense. So I'm a feminist research or in social studies, researching feminists in social studies. So I have this inside, first of all, kind of like allegiance to my fellow feminists. And also I have an understanding of what it means to be a feminist in social studies, the struggles, what it was like to try to find women to put in my classroom, all that stuff. But then I'm also an outsider in this study because I'm saying, well, hold up, wait a minute, let me step outside of this problem as a self-evident truth so I can study it and I can break it down and I can look at things like context and frames and practices. And so it creates kind of this like feeling of being in two places at once. I am both an advocate within the struggle of feminist social studies, but I'm also on the sidelines interpreting, looking, and analyzing, and it can feel very difficult as I'm doing this analysis to know which one is appropriate to wield at what time, or perhaps to be both at once. And that has been a real challenge for me. Another issue that I've been really contending with is the idea of accountability. as I was learning and reading in this project, I was really taken aback and felt honestly very moved at the feminists in this field who have come before me, who have enabled me to be who I am today, to even be in this place to speak. And so it felt uneasy at times to be reading these feminist work who I admire for analysis, which could be considered a critique. I don't want to take from their work without making sure that what I'm producing and saying is relevant and part of their cause. So I put the puzzle pieces here because I started to really view myself as I am a part of a puzzle that has been built before me and will continue to be built, and that my work should be accountable to the feminist that I am drawing on for my analysis. And this quote by Sarah Ahmed, I've been reading her really lovely book, Living a Feminist Life, helped me recenter on this idea of what does feminism, mean to me in this project. And she says that, feminism brings to mind women in these multitude of ways that have struggled for more bearable worlds. Maybe it's refusal, maybe it's rebellion, but maybe it's these quiet ways of not holding on to things that diminish us. And it brings to mind women who have stood up, spoke out, and risked their lives and careers. And I think about Noddings, and I think about Caraco, and I think about Bowen, and I realize that theirs is a struggle for a more bearable world within the social studies through refusal, rebellion, but also in these quiet ways, and saying, okay, well, if I have to talk about central concerns within the field, then that's what I'm going to do to keep pushing it forward. And that helped me really orient to the idea of how can I be accountable to feminists within the social studies and kind of understand their work while also pushing forward my project, which I feel is important. And finally, genealogies are just hard. Well, I guess I found it really hard, harder than I anticipated, I suppose. So the first thing that makes genealogies hard is that they're not looking for like a capital T truth claim. They're coming out of that postmodern, post-structural orientation that says, all truths are produced in certain contexts and they're contingent and contextual. So as I was writing, as I was reading, as I was analyzing, I kept coming up against this wall saying, well, like, this is just my interpretation, but others could be different. And it really made me pause and think about what kind of truth I was trying to construct, and then to what ends, like how can it be used? Another issue is that genealogy entails this like meticulous attention to detail. So it's not just what do the words say, but you could think about things like what kind of text is it? Is it a research handbook? Is it a journal article? You would think about the context surrounding the production of the piece. So is this happening in the 70s during the women's movement? Is this happening in some other context? So as I was trying to pay really close attention to these details, but also finish my project and kind of bound the analysis in some sort of way to kind of push something forward, I felt very nervous about which details to include and which details to kind of omit, because I understand that this type of project especially is crafted around details that matter. But Christensen, another genealogist working in education, kind of says, well, that's the point. This process is never supposed to lead me to the ultimate, capital T truth conclusion about why feminism is being described as marginal, but instead it is a tool to look at specific practices, to break the practices down, and to see how they interrelate. And so that helps me think about how to continue as I finish analyzing and interpreting my data, to not feel so stuck in terms of this contingent truths and also the amount of detail that I'm looking for. So I thank you guys so much for listening to my presentation. I would love to hear your feedback, and just thank you for a wonderful class.